Edmund Calloway married a woman everyone expected him to bury within the year. That was the quiet joke passed through drawing rooms across the county, whispered behind fans, the moment the Duke of Harrowmere left his frail, fevered bride alone in a crumbling northern estate only 2 days after their wedding. He gave her his name, a leaking roof, and nothing else. He expected the next letter about her to arrive edged in black. He did not imagine that 4 years later he would ride back to that same house and find it warm, alive, and ruled entirely by a woman who had simply refused to disappear. If stories about quiet resilience and love that grows slowly, instead of all at once, are the kind you enjoy, stay with this one and tap follow now so the rest of the chapters find you without having to search. The ink on the parish register was still drying when Edmund signed his name for the second time that morning. Beside his signature, the handwriting of his new wife trembled across the page, Clara Whitmore, soon to be Clara Calloway. The chapel was cold and empty, holding only the priest, the debt-ridden father of the bride, and a draught that rattled the old glass. There were no flowers anywhere in the building. There was no music. It was simply an arrangement, none of the softness that usually hides the cold business beneath a noble wedding. Lord Whitmore needed £40,000 to keep his last properties from being seized by men he owed for years. Edmund needed a wife to satisfy a clause in the will of his late father, a clause standing between him and a diplomatic post overseas. He glanced at the woman now bound to him by law. She was small inside a heavy grey travelling dress, her skin pale as old china, her breathing coming in short, uneven pulls. As though summoned by his attention, she pressed a handkerchief to her mouth and gave way to a rattling cough. Her father turned his face away, embarrassed, as though her illness were bad manners on display. Edmund only watched her, his expression giving nothing away, his thoughts already occupied with troop counts and the long game played by men in expensive coats. "The carriage is waiting," Edmund said, his voice deep and even, filling the hollow room. Clara lowered the handkerchief. Her eyes were a pale hazel, rimmed red from exhaustion, yet sharp underneath. She offered no apology for the interruption caused by her own body. She simply answered that she was ready and called him by his title rather than his name. The road north took the better part of a day, and they rode in silence the entire way. Greymore Hall was his most distant property, tucked into the wet, unwelcoming hills of the north, left empty for 2 generations, a place where unwanted things were sent to be forgotten. When the carriage finally stopped in the fading evening light, Clara looked through the rain-streaked window and saw the house rise against the darkening sky like something already half dead. Ivy had climbed the stone walls, roots dug into the mortar. Half the windows were black, the other half catching the weak light of a single lantern held by an old servant on the cracked steps. Edmund stepped down first, the mud swallowing his boots at once. He did not offer his hand to help her down, his mind already calculating the miles between this house and London. Clara climbed down alone and stood beside him in the freezing drizzle. "Mrs. Prescott will show you to your rooms," he said, barely glancing at the building. "The estate produces little income, but my solicitor will send an allowance for your needs. I ride for the coast at first light." Clara pulled her cloak tighter. "How long will you be away?" she asked, her voice flat and resigned. "As long as duty requires," Edmund answered, looking down at her properly for the first time. In the grey light, she seemed dangerously delicate, thin enough that a strong wind could break her. Something twisted briefly in his chest, not quite pity, more a cold understanding of fact. Her lungs were failing. Physicians in London had given her a year at most, less if the winter turned harsh. "The air here is meant to be good for weak lungs," he said. "I trust you will find some peace in this place, Clara." It was dismissal dressed as courtesy, a polite way of telling her to fade quietly and cause no trouble. "I understand," she said, her voice steady though her hands shook faintly. Edmund touched his hat, turned and walked toward the stables where a fresh horse waited saddled. He did not look back once. He told himself this was simply the practical choice, that lingering would only invite a painful scene. He rode through the rusted gates as rain began falling in earnest, leaving his new wife alone in the mud, staring up at a house that looked more like a grave than a home. Inside, the cold felt absolute. Mrs. Prescott, a thin woman with tired eyes, led Clara through long hallways covered in dust sheets, the air thick with mildew and neglect. "His Grace only told us of your arrival yesterday," the housekeeper murmured. "We only had time to prepare the master chamber in the east wing, and the fireplace there does not draw well." Clara followed, her chest burning with every breath. When she was finally left alone in a large, drafty bedroom, she sat on the edge of the mattress. She did not cry. Crying required breath, and she had none to waste. She understood exactly what her new husband thought of her, a broken thing purchased with a title, and left to rot quietly in an old house. She pulled the thin blankets to her chin and let the fever take her. The first months at Greymore Hall passed in a blur of pain and delirium. Winter arrived hard, and in January Clara nearly died. Fever turned her skin to fire and her thoughts to smoke, and for weeks she drifted through hallucination, coughing until she tasted blood. Mrs. Prescott and the two remaining staff, a groundsman named Samuel and a kitchen maid named Agnes, tended to her with the calm patience of people who had watched this sickness take others before. They kept a weak fire burning and forced thin broth past her lips, waiting for the morning they would find her cold. That morning never arrived. Sometime in late winter, the fever finally broke. Clara opened her eyes, weak enough that her bones stood out sharply beneath her skin, but her mind was completely clear. She listened to the loose window frame rattling in the wind, and something shifted inside her, sharp and certain. She was not going to die here, waiting for a husband who had already written her off as a burden he no longer had to think about. "Mrs. Prescott," she called, her voice dry as old paper. "Get me out of this bed, and get me out of this room," Clara rasped. It took 2 days to arrange the move. Leaning heavily on Agnes, Clara forced herself out of the massive, unheatable chamber and walked the corridors slowly, ignoring the burning ache in her lungs, until she found a small ground-floor room facing south, with a modest hearth and one wide window that caught the winter sun. "This one," she said, leaning against the doorframe, breathless but sure of herself. "But your Grace—" This was the parlor of the housekeeper. "It is not fit for a duchess," Mrs. Prescott protested. "I do not need a duchess room," Clara replied. "I need a room that is not trying to kill me. Move my things." That was the turning point. Clara stopped behaving like a dying woman and started behaving like a living one who happened to be unwell. She went through the household ledgers and found the small, steady allowance sent by the solicitor of Edmund had been wasted for years on things nobody used: polished silver for empty rooms, candles burning in halls no one entered. She cut the waste at once. "We close off the east and west wings," she told Samuel. "Drain the pipes there so they do not burst in the frost. Bring everyone into the central block, and use what we save to buy seasoned firewood, keeping fires burning day and night in the rooms we actually use." The staff were startled, but they obeyed. For the first time in decades, Greymore Hall had someone in charge who cared whether the wind cut through the floorboards. When spring finally broke through the frozen ground, Clara went outside for the first time. She found the old kitchen garden buried under weeds, and instead of ornamental roses, she had Samuel clear the ground and sent to the village for practical seeds: thyme, rosemary, mint, plants with a purpose. At first, she could only sit on a bench for a few minutes watching Samuel work. Slowly, she began to join him, kneeling in the dirt in her ruined skirts, the labor exhausting her completely. Some days, pulling a single stubborn root left her gasping on the grass for half an hour, but she never stopped. "You will catch your death out here, Your Grace," Mrs. Prescott would fret. "I am catching my life, Mrs. Prescott," Clara would answer. She started brewing tea from the herbs she grew herself, never pretending she was cured. The rattle in her chest remained, faithful and constant, and some days the weather turned and she could not leave her bed at all. But she was no longer fading. She was adjusting, and the house adjusted with her. She bought heavy wool rugs for the cold floors, had the local blacksmith repair the kitchen ranges, so the house smelled of baking bread instead of mildew, and spent her evenings reading books on farming and estate management. She stopped waiting for letters from Edmund. Village gossip placed him in Vienna, then in the east, then in the south, negotiating treaties, advising powerful men. To Clara, he had become a character in a story she no longer thought about. She had taken an empty ruin and filled it with warmth through sheer will. She did not need a husband. She had a home. 3 years passed like this, and it had been 3 years of noise for Edmund Calloway. He rode north with his posture stiff and his eyes ringed with the deep exhaustion of a man who had seen far too much. The continent had drained everything out of him, negotiating over tables stained with spilled wine, sleeping in tents, stepping over the bodies of soldiers he himself had ordered forward. London celebrated him as a hero, and he stayed just long enough to satisfy the men who mattered. Then he left, unable to bear the suffocating chatter of the ballrooms. He needed the total silence of Greymore Hall. Communication had broken down entirely during the worst of the fighting, and the last report from his solicitor, over a year old, simply confirmed that funds were still being drawn. He assumed she was either clinging to life by a thread or already gone and buried, with no one having thought to inform him. He had prepared himself, quietly, for a grave. He reached the boundary of the estate in the late afternoon, under a sky the color of bruised iron. He braced for the sight of collapsed gates and an overgrown drive. Instead, his horse stepped onto a carefully maintained gravel path. The heavy iron gates, rusted and hanging off their hinges when he left, now stood upright, scraped clean, and painted a deep protective black. This was not the abandoned ruin he remembered leaving behind. If you have ever watched a story where someone builds their whole world back from nothing, this is exactly that kind of turn, and if it is pulling you in, this is a good moment to like the video and leave a comment about who you think has changed the most so far. As the manor came fully into view, his shock deepened. The house was not entirely restored. The east and west wings sat clearly shuttered and boarded, but the central block was alive. The windows caught the afternoon light cleanly. The ivy had been cut back from the stonework to stop further rot. Thick white smoke rose steadily from the chimneys, carrying the scent of roasting meat and burning apple wood. Edmund dismounted at the front steps. There was no mud here. The stones had been scrubbed and leveled. He tied his horse and pushed open the heavy front door without knocking, since it remained, after all, his house. Inside, the damp chill he remembered was gone. The air was genuinely warm. A woven runner covered the once cracked floorboards. A vase of dried lavender sat on a polished entry table. The silence he had craved for months was nowhere to be found. Instead, he heard low voices from the kitchens and the steady rhythm of a knife against a cutting board. He walked down the hallway, passing the old formal drawing room, its doors firmly shut, drawn instead toward the warmth coming from the back of the house. He found her in an estate office he had not even known existed. The door stood slightly open. Edmund stopped in the frame. Clara stood at a heavy desk, bent over architectural drawings and columns of figures, her sleeves pushed up, a pencil tucked behind her ear. She looked up, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. "I apologize for the inconvenience, Your Grace," she finally said, her voice smooth, polite, and cold as the winter outside. "I imagine mourning clothes for a widow would have been far less trouble for you to manage." Edmund flinched inwardly, the remark landing exactly where it was aimed, entirely fair. He stepped fully into the room, the scent of rosemary and old paper reaching him. "I did not mean," he started, and stopped. He was a man who had talked down hostile generals, yet he found himself grasping for words. "This house, it is different now." "The house is functional," Clara corrected him evenly, turning to Samuel, who had been standing nearby. "That will be all for today, Samuel. Please see to the horse of his grace." "Yes, your grace," Samuel said. Hurrying past Edmund, eager to escape the tension in the room. When they were alone, Edmund stepped closer, glancing at the ledgers, then back at his wife. She watched him without wavering, like someone defending a border against an invader. "I expected ruins," Edmund said quietly, dropping any pretense of formal distance, too tired for it. "You left ruins," Clara answered, lifting her chin a fraction. "I simply refuse to be buried under them." Edmund stared at her, feeling an unfamiliar tightness in his chest. Nothing like the ache of war or the cold dread of politics, something entirely new. He had come home looking for an empty tomb to disappear into, and instead he had walked straight into a fortress, standing face to face with the woman who had built it herself. "I have returned, Clara," he said, the weight of the statement settling over him like a heavy coat. She did not smile, and she did not welcome him, only looked him over once, noting the grey now threading through his hair. "So I see," she said. "We will need to find you a room. The east wing is closed." Dinner that night was quiet and plain, served not in the grand dining hall, but in a small, panelled breakfast room near the kitchens. Edmund sat at the head of the modest table, the only concession the house made toward his rank, everything else belonging entirely to Clara. The fine porcelain of his family had been replaced by sturdy, unchipped stoneware. Silver cutlery was gone, replaced with plain iron that needed no polishing. Mrs. Prescott poured a cheap, robust red wine from the village instead of the imported vintages Edmund was used to in London. "The east wing will remain closed," Clara said, breaking the silence without looking up from her plate. "We have neither the coal to heat it nor the staff to clean it. Mrs. Prescott has prepared the blue room for you, on the ground floor, sharing a chimney with my parlour, so the fire draws properly there." Edmund cut into his bread, dense with oats. "I see you have reorganized my entire household," he said. "I turned a mausoleum into a home." Clara corrected him smoothly, taking a sip of wine. "If you prefer the grandeur of freezing in the master suite, Samuel can unlock it tomorrow, though you will need to gather your own firewood." Edmund set down his knife. 3 years ago she would never have spoken to him this way, buried under the weight of her failing lungs and his cold indifference. He studied the faint, rapid pulse at her throat. She was still unwell. He could hear the careful, shallow way she breathed to avoid a cough, but she was no longer a victim of anything. "The blue room will be fine," he said. A flicker of surprise crossed her eyes before disappearing just as quickly. The next morning Edmund woke to steady, rhythmic thumping somewhere in the house. He dressed simply and stepped out to find the manor already humming with purpose. He walked toward the stables, intending to have his horse readied for a tour of the estate boundaries, and found Samuel in the courtyard fixing a broken wagon wheel. "Samuel, saddle my horse, I ride in 20 minutes, Edmund said. Samuel paused, glancing nervously toward the office window. "Begging your pardon, your grace, but I must ask her grace first. She told me to finish this axle before noon, so we can carry the winter squash to market." Edmund stared at him. He was the Duke, he owned this land, and yet a groundsman stood waiting for direction from someone else entirely. A sharp reply rose in his throat, the instinct of a commander whose order had just been questioned. He swallowed it. He understood something plainly. He had abandoned this place. She had saved it. And loyalty was never a legal right, it was earned. "Finish the wheel, Samuel," he said quietly. "I will saddle my own horse." Over the following days, he realized exactly how unnecessary he had become. He pulled the household ledgers from the desk of Clara while she worked in the garden, expecting to find careless arithmetic from a woman with no training in estate management. Instead, he found a work of ruthless, practical genius. She had leased the neglected lower pastures to a neighboring sheep farmer in exchange for a share of the wool and meat, avoiding the cost of hired shepherds entirely. She had sold the ornamental lead from the ruined fountain to fund the slate needed to patch the roof. "If you are looking for missing funds, you will not find any," Clara said from the doorway. a basket of freshly cut thyme on her arm, her boots caked in mud, entirely unapologetic. "I am not auditing you, Clara," Edmund said, closing the ledger. "I am simply trying to understand how my own estate now runs." "It runs because we waste neither time nor heat," she said, stepping into the small room, "and because we do not spend money on appearances. If you intend to stay, Your Grace, you must understand that this house cannot support the life of a duke. There are no valets here and no footmen. If you drop your coat on the floor, it stays there until you pick it up yourself. I have spent 2 years sleeping in canvas tents, eating salted meat that tasted of gunpowder," Edmund said, his voice low. "I require no valet." He stood, towering over her, though she remained fierce despite her fragile frame. "I am not here to undo your work, Clara," he said carefully, as though negotiating a treaty. "I am simply here." She studied his face, searching for a lie, and found none. "Then stay out of my way," she said, and turned back to her garden. By the 3rd week, the sharp hostility between them had settled into a careful, watchful truce. Edmund kept his word. He chopped firewood, repaired the heavy oak doors. Samuel struggled to lift alone and rode the boundaries of the estate. He watched her, and slowly he learned the shape of her illness. Damp mornings were the worst, and she stayed in her parlor until the sun burned the dew away, drinking a bitter tea made from mullein. He learned that when she pushed too hard, a dangerous flush would rise in her cheeks, followed by a cough that sounded like tearing cloth. He wanted to order her to rest, but he knew she would simply remind him he had forfeited any right to command her health 3 years earlier. His chance to prove useful arrived through a sealed letter from Lord Pemberton, the neighboring landowner. Edmund found Clara standing over her desk, hands trembling with fury around a piece of parchment. "He cannot do this," Clara said, her voice breaking into a rough cough she forced down. "He is choking off the lower stream. The mill will run dry by the end of summer." "What is the trouble?" he asked. She thrust the parchment at him, too frustrated for pride. "Lord Pemberton claims the old boundary line runs 50 yards further into our land than surveyed, and he is building a dam to create a private fishing pond. It will cut off the water to our mill entirely, and I have written to him twice already." This is his reply. Edmund read the letter, written in a flowery, condescending hand, explaining that the law was simply the law, and a woman could hardly be expected to understand old property charters. A slow, cold smile crossed his face, the same smile that had once made a foreign ambassador step back at a peace conference. "You are handling this the wrong way," he said, setting the letter down. "I am handling it logically," Clara snapped. "I sent him copies of the land registry." "Men like Pemberton do not respond to logic," Edmund said. "They respond to leverage." He pulled a fresh sheet of vellum from the drawer and picked up her quill. "Pemberton inherited his wealth and bought his standing," Edmund murmured as he wrote. "He believes he is bullying a sickly widow. He does not yet know I am home. He did not threaten a lawsuit and did not mention the stream at all. He simply wrote a brief, exquisitely polite note informing Lord Pemberton that the Duke of Harrowmere had returned to residence, and that he looked forward to discussing certain irregular tax filings in the House of Lords," adding a postscript inquiring after the nephew of Pemberton, whose gambling debts in London Edmund happened to have purchased before leaving for the continent. He sealed it with his signet and handed it to Samuel. "Deliver this, and wait for a response." 2 hours later, Samuel returned with a frantic apology from Lord Pemberton, promising the dam would be dismantled before nightfall. "That was blackmail," Clara said. "That was diplomacy," Edmund corrected, not looking up from the boots he was cleaning. A deep, easy silence settled over the room, and for the first time since his return, the air between them did not feel like a weapon. "Thank you," Clara said quietly. "You built the mill, Clara," he said. "I only protected the water." The fragile piece was tested 3 days later when the weather turned violently. A brutal, unseasonal storm swept down from the hills, bringing freezing rain in sheets. Edmund secured the horses and ran back toward the house, expecting to find Clara safely by the fire. Instead, he found the front door standing open, Agnes gathering soaked rugs in a panic. "Where is she?" Edmund demanded. "The herb garden, Your Grace. The drainage ditch overflowed. She went out to clear it." Edmund did not wait. He ran through the rain and found her kneeling in the freezing mud, hacking at the earth with a heavy spade, soaked through, trying desperately to save the fragile seedlings she had spent months growing. She was not coughing. She was suffocating. She dropped the spade, her hands flying to her chest as her body convulsed, struggling to pull air through lungs full of fluid and cold. "Clara," Edmund reached her in 3 strides and, without asking permission, lifted her from the mud. She weighed nothing, like a bundle of wet, freezing sticks in his arms. She fought him blindly for a moment before her head fell against his shoulder, her lips turning a frightening shade of blue. He carried her straight to her parlor, shouting for Mrs. Prescott to bring hot bricks and towels, his voice carrying the same authority he once used commanding men. He set her down before the fire, his hands shaking, but his movements precise. He stripped away her soaked cloak and wrapped her in dry blankets. He packed hot stones around her shivering body, kneeling beside her, pulling her upright against his chest until she finally managed to drag a ragged breath into her lungs. "Breathe," he whispered against her damp hair. "Just breathe." "I have you. You are safe," she coughed, a wet, terrible sound that shook against his ribs, but as the heat from the fire and from him soaked into her skin, the blue faded slowly from her lips. She closed her eyes, exhausted, frightened, and entirely dependent on the man she had once sworn she did not need. Edmund did not let go. For the first time in his life, he was exactly where he needed to be. Clara survived the chill, though it left her weak for a full week, and it forced a hard truth back to the surface for both of them. Not long after, another storm rolled through the hills, this one bringing thunder that rattled the window panes through the night. Clara woke to find Edmund missing from his room and followed the sound of ragged breathing to the drawing room. She found him on the floor near the cold hearth, curled in on himself, his hands pressed over his ears, his whole body shaking. She had spent 3 years imagining his absence as balls and easy conversation with foreign dignitaries. She had never once considered the actual weight of the work he had been doing, that he had not simply signed treaties, he had stood in the slaughter itself. Thunder cracked again, and Edmund flinched hard, dropping to one knee, arms thrown over his head as though bracing for artillery fire. Clara did not call for the servants, understanding instinctively that he would never forgive being seen this way, stripped bare, reduced to trembling by his own memories. She walked toward him slowly, letting her footsteps sound clearly against the floor. "Edmund," she said, her voice calm and low, the same tone she used to settle a frightened horse. He turned his head sharply toward her, and for one terrible moment she saw only violence in his eyes, the reflex of a cornered soldier who did not recognize her. She stopped a few feet away, did not reach for him, and lowered herself instead to sit on the cold floor in front of him, placing herself beneath his line of sight, removing any sense of threat. "The artillery is gone," Clara said softly, gesturing toward the window. "It is only rain against the glass. You are in Yorkshire. You are at Greymore Hall." Edmund stared at her, his chest heaving. "Look at me," she said, her voice firming, anchoring him to the present. "I am Clara. Look at the stones. Look at the hearth. You are home." A ragged breath tore out of him, and the wildness in his eyes gradually gave way to something raw and clear. He looked at the floorboards, at his own shaking hands, then at his wife sitting on the freezing floor in her nightgown, her eyes fixed steadily on him. He covered his face with both hands, and a broken sound escaped him, muffled against his palms. 3 years of holding himself together finally gave way. He did not weep exactly, but he shook, the collapse of a man who had carried far too much weight for far too long. Clara moved then, sliding across the floor until she knelt beside him, placing one hand flat against his back, between his shoulder blades. He was rigid, cold, damp with sweat. She simply kept her hand there, steady, a quiet reminder that he was not falling apart alone. They stayed on the floor a long time. When the thunder finally rolled away, leaving only steady rain, Edmund lowered his hands and leaned back against the wall, hollowed out, stripped bare. I ordered a cavalry charge outside a town he could not bring himself to name, Edmund said, his voice hollow. The fog was too thick. I misjudged the flank of the enemy. 400 men rode straight into a marsh and were slaughtered. The mud looked like blood, he said, closing his eyes. I still dream of the mud. Clara listened without offering empty comfort. Understanding that men like him carried their guilt the way others carried faith, and to dismiss it would be to dismiss his honor entirely. Instead, she stood, righted an overturned chair, and walked to the hearth, coaxing the dying fire back into a proper flame with the iron poker. The room slowly warmed. The mud here is only mud, Clara said quietly, turning to face him. It grows rosemary and thyme, and it ruins my skirts. It does not bleed, Edmund. She crossed the room and extended a hand. Get up off the floor. You will catch a chill. And I refuse to nurse you while I still have a mill to repair. Edmund looked at her, offered hand, small, pale, and remarkably strong, and took it. He stood before her, the ghosts in his mind pushed back by the plain, grounding presence of the woman in front of him. He had left her to die, and she had learned instead to live. He had come home looking for a grave, and she was quietly teaching him how to survive. Come, she said, turning toward the door. I am making tea, and you are going to drink it. He followed her out of the shadows without another word. Summer eventually baked the damp out of Greymore Hall. The heat was harsh, but it treated the lungs of Clara far more kindly than winter ever had, and for the first time in years she went a full month without tasting blood in her throat. The estate shifted from quiet refuge into a busy stage of labor. The barley crop came in heavy, and the freed lower stream powered the mill from dawn to dusk. Edmund did not oversee the harvest from beneath a shaded canopy. He stripped off his coat, rolled his sleeves, and worked the fields alongside the laborers, hauling grain sacks beside Samuel, swinging a scythe when the hired hands fell behind. His hands blistered and scraped raw. The villagers, who had once regarded the returning duke with nervous formality, began to watch him instead with quiet, genuine respect. Clara managed the logistics from a wooden table set up in the courtyard, a wide straw hat shielding her pale face from the sun, tallying yields, paying the seasonal workers, arranging transport to market. She watched him from a distance, the sun catching the sweat on his shoulders, a man built for war finally pouring that energy into the earth instead. The shadows that had consumed him during the spring storm stayed locked away, buried under honest exhaustion. Late one August evening, the courtyard finally fell quiet, the last wagon secured, the workers gone home. Clara remained at her table, head resting on her hand, staring blankly at a column of figures, her chest tight from sheer physical exhaustion rather than illness. A shadow fell across the ledger, and Edmund set a tin cup of cold water down over her numbers, his forearms streaked with dirt and barley chaff. The numbers will still be there tomorrow, he said. Clara looked up and took the cup with both hands, drinking gratefully. We beat last year yield by 30%, she said. The sheep paid for the extra labor, and the grain will cover the slate for the west wing roof. We do not need the west, said, pulling up a stool across from her. The central block is secure. Save the money for winter coal instead. Let the west wing fall. I thought a duke required at least one grand hall to entertain his equals, she said. Edmund let out a low, tired laugh. My equals would take one look at my hands and assume I had lost my mind entirely, he said, turning his palms upward, calloused, scraped, permanently stained with soil. Let them stay in London. I have no interest in entertaining ghosts. He looked across the table at her, the twilight softening the sharp lines of her face. She looked tired, but a fierce, undeniable energy still hummed beneath her skin. She was no longer the fragile girl shivering in a cold chapel. She was the architect of everything that had saved him. You look well, Clara, he said quietly. And it was not a polite compliment, it was a plain, deeply relieved observation. "I am surviving," she replied. "You are leading," he corrected. He reached across the table, not asking permission, and placed his large, rough hand over hers, trapping the tin cup between them. "And I am following," she said. A year earlier, his touch would have frightened her. Now it steadied her completely. She turned her hand slightly, lacing her fingers through his. They sat together in the darkening courtyard, two worn people holding onto each other in the quiet ruins of the life they had once abandoned. If you have made it this far into the story, this is exactly the kind of moment worth telling us about in the comments. And if you want more slow-burning stories like this one, this is a good time to subscribe, so nothing gets missed. The outside world finally broke through the walls of Greymore Hall in the autumn. Exactly 4 years to the day since their wedding, frost lay thick over the fields. Clara was in the kitchen teaching Agnes how to properly cure the winter hams when she heard the unmistakable sound of hooves striking the frozen gravel of the main drive, not the slow step of a farm horse, but the sharp, urgent rhythm of a full gallop. Edmund was already at the door, pulling it open. A rider dressed in royal courier livery stood on the steps, his horse blowing hard in the cold air. He bowed sharply, pulling a heavy sealed envelope from his satchel. "Your Grace, urgent dispatches from the capital," he said. "The Prime Minister expects an immediate reply." Edmund took the letter and did not break the seal, simply staring at the wax, his jaw tightening until a muscle jumped in his cheek. The sight of the royal crest seemed to drain the color from his face, dragging him back toward the cold, calculating world he had spent months trying to escape. "Samuel will take you to the kitchens. Get warm. Feed your horse," Edmund told the courier, his voice flat. He closed the door and stood in the hall, the heavy envelope hanging from his hand like dead weight. Clara felt a cold stone settle in her stomach. She had always known this day would come, that a man like the Duke of Harrowmere was never allowed to vanish into the hills forever, that the crown eventually always came to collect its own weapons. Every wall she had let down over the summer slammed back into place at once, pure instinct for survival. If she felt nothing, his leaving could not break her. "I will have Mrs. Prescott prepare your trunks," Clara said, her voice perfectly flat, the voice of a housekeeper rather than a wife. "The roads to the capital will turn dangerous within the week. You should leave at dawn." Edmund's head snapped toward her, his eyes wide with sudden anger. "You do not even know what the letter says," he said. "It says they need you," Clara replied, untying her apron and laying it neatly on the entry table. "Whether it is the French or a border dispute in the east, it does not matter. You are the Duke of Harrowmere. They have a war and they need you to solve it. Your duty belongs to the crown." "My duty," Edmund repeated, his voice going dangerously quiet. "Yes," she said, refusing to look at his face, staring instead at the polished floor. "You have played farmer for a season. You have paid your penance for leaving me here. Your conscience is clear now, Edmund. You are free to go." She turned to walk back toward the kitchens, needing distance from him. Edmund moved faster than she thought possible, closing the distance in 3 strides and catching her arm, not hurting her, but holding firm, turning her to face him. "Stop," he said. Clara looked up, her eyes blazing with sudden, defensive anger. "Let go of me, you have a carriage to pack," she snapped. He did not let go. Instead, he raised the sealed envelope in his other hand, still unopened, and walked toward the fireplace in the drawing room adjacent to the hall, where a small fire kept the damp at bay, and tossed the letter directly into the flames. Clara gasped, stepping forward. "Have you lost your mind?" "That is a royal dispatch," she said. "I do not care," Edmund said, watching the thick parchment blacken and curl as the fire consumed the seal of the sovereign. He turned to face her, the anger in his eyes burned away, replaced by a fierce, unshakable clarity. "I spent my entire adult life trading pieces of myself to keep kings on their thrones," he said, his voice ringing through the quiet hall. "I sent men to die in the mud for borders that changed again a week later. I gave the crown my youth, my peace, and nearly my sanity. He closed the last distance between them, stopping inches away, looking down into her startled eyes. I am not going back to the capital, he said. I am not returning to the ballrooms, and I am not returning to the slaughter. I do not care if the whole continent burns. The breath of Clara caught. The cold stone in her stomach began to crack. Edmund, they will strip you of every commission. They will call you a coward, she said. Let them, he said softly, reaching up to frame her face with his rough, calloused hands, his thumbs brushing gently along her cheekbones. I left a dying girl in a tomb because I was a coward once already. I came back to find a woman ruling a fortress. You built this home out of dirt and stubborn defiance. You saved my estate, Clara, and then you saved me. Her throat tightened, the urge to cough rising with sudden overwhelming feeling, but she pushed it down. Her eyes filled with unwanted tears. I am still unwell, Edmund. Winter will always be hard for me. I cannot promise you that I will not. She started and could not finish the thought. I do not want a promise about forever, he whispered, resting his forehead against hers. I want today, and I want tomorrow, and I want to freeze in the mud with you, trying to save the barley. This is my home now, Clara. You are my home, and I am never leaving again. Clara closed her eyes, and the last of her guarded armor finally cracked and fell away. She gripped the rough linen of his shirt, and, after 4 years of cold distance, let her full weight lean into him at last. He held her tightly, a fixed point against the coming winter. The house around them quiet, and smelling of wood smoke and rosemary, fiercely alive, and finally completely whole. That is the end of this story. And if it stayed with you the way we hoped it would, take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who loves a slow burning romance built on quiet strength rather than grand gestures, and subscribe so the next full story finds you the moment it is ready.